Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I wanted to do my reading wrap-up for the month of May. Overall, it was a pretty good month. I read 12 books. I went into kind of a crime thriller phase, and so that was fun. So there was lots of police procedurals and murder mysteries this month. And I also continued my mythology retelling thing that I'm in right now, whatever that is. So that was kind of the most of the month, was either mythology retellings or crime novels. So let's get into what I liked, what I didn't like, and what I'm looking forward to next month. So starting off with series I finished, and I don't know if this really counts. This is kind of a cheat because there are other books in the series, but it's like a prequel series that leads up to things, and that is the Prime Suspect trilogy by Linda LaPlante. Now, I believe these were written at the same time as the TV series Prime Suspect, which she was the writer for. She created it. And it's just a trilogy of books, and so I feel like the books were written kind of alongside the TV series. And there's also a prequel series of a bunch of books that she does that kind of tell how the main character sort of gets to the point where she is at the beginning of that trilogy. But I did finish those 3 books. And my thoughts of them are kind of complicated because there's stuff that I really, really liked about them. She writes dialogue so well. Her main character is flawed and complicated and interesting, and I genuinely really, really liked it. Jane Tennyson is a great heroine. And the first book blew me away. Like, it's a fairly standard police procedural sort of murder mystery, but it really, really blew me away. It felt so raw and real. The main character was dealing with issues of her own and dealing with issues in her workplace, and it just worked for me really, really well. The second and third books, while they were well constructed and the dialogue again was always on point, I felt like the main character just sort of stopped having really any kind of complexity in her either personal life or her work. There was a little bit of stuff here and there. The main thing in the first book was that she wasn't respected by her job, and she was fighting kind of systemic sexism in the workplace. And in the second and third books, it had kind of toned down. I guess it was supposed to show that people had come to accept her and everything, but I don't know, I just felt like there needed to be more of that. Yes, there's a cat. There needed to be more of that friction between her and her colleagues. It wasn't really a negative, it just sort of felt a little easy, and that's kind of what drew me in the first place, was seeing her fighting this uphill battle against this workplace that was very chauvinistic. And it was written in the 90s, so early 90s, and it was kind of a good window into sort of that decade where everyone had kind of thought that we had moved past everything. All of the isms, the racism, sexism, all of those were kind of in the past, and we had kind of moved into the future, and everyone got along, and it was very naive. The 90s were very, very naive. And this book sort of tackled that, and I really appreciated it. The second one was more about sort of the racial biases of the police against immigrant communities, which is a very valid thing. It's a very real thing. We're still seeing that today, but I felt like it didn't feel really genuine the way she portrayed it. She kind of resorted to some stereotypes when describing sort of the characters in the kind of immigrant community, and so it felt like her heart was in the right place. I'm not going to say like, this is a bad book because it misrepresented things. It was very clear her heart was in the right place, and she was tackling a very real issue, and I appreciated that, but it just didn't feel as genuine and real. It felt a little contrived. And then the third book was looking at sort of queer communities and the underground at that point, because 90s was still very much the age of sort of don't ask, don't tell. And again, it was good. I felt like she handled it fairly well. There was one moment that was sort of delightfully camp, where 2 of the officers have to sort of dress in drag in order to infiltrate this bar. And so overall I thought it was fine, but it was one of those things where it was like, it just didn't feel quite as raw and gritty. It felt a little more goofy and fun, and I think the point of that was so that it didn't sort of become so depressing because the murder itself was very bleak and depressing, and so the book kind of had to be sort of a little more fun and goofy to sort of keep the reader from being super mega depressed. But I don't know, I just felt like the trilogy overall, it didn't blow me away. The first book is really, really good, and I loved Linda LaPlante's writing, dialogue, everything was just phenomenal. But police procedurals in general have a bad habit of resorting to sort of stereotypes. Any of them. If you watch like CSI, especially the original CSI, they'll have episodes where it's like, and this week we're looking at this subculture or this minority, and there's so many stereotypes, and they kind of reduce these people to sort of, you know, there's the cops who are sort of the correct and conventional people, and then there's like looking through the glass in the enclosure of these like weird subcultures, be like, oh my god, look how weird they are. And even if the episodes did their best to sort of humanize them, the police procedural format in general always sort of feels like you're looking at communities in a fishbowl from the outside. And so that's kind of a problem with police procedurals in general. But overall, I did enjoy these books, and I really like Linda LaPlante's writing. I'm curious to read more of her work. Next up on the list is series that I started, and there was a couple, but one that I think stands out was Claire North's Ithaca. This is one where, when I was about halfway through the first book, I wasn't entirely sure if this was going to be something that kind of grabbed me, because it's very slow burn, and I don't mind slower burn things, but because of the structure of the story, this is telling the story of what was going on in Ithaca during the events of the Odyssey, and specifically the events of like the action of the Odyssey, none of the flashbacks. So we don't get anything before, you know, looking back. It starts off with like Odysseus is on Calypso's island, and Telemachus is about to like head out and go in search of his father, and Penelope is at home with all the suitors, kind of thing. And so I was like, there isn't really a lot that can happen. And so in order to fill in, not to fill in the action, but to give more complexity and give Penelope more to do, the first two books of this series sort of line up with like the Orestia. So you've got Electra and Orestes and Clytemnestra and the fallout from all of that. There's a cat in the background playing with a toy, so that's why it's crinkly. And so I was worried that it would sort of be too much about other characters and not really about Penelope herself. But it proved me wrong. I'm fully invested. I'm reading the third book right now, and it is phenomenal. The slow build-up, the character arcs. Each story is, or each book is narrated by a different goddess. So the first one is narrated by Hera, who's sort of following Clytemnestra because she's sort of her favorite. The second book is narrated by Aphrodite, because she's sort of following Helen of Troy, because Helen features in the second book at one point. And then the third book is narrated by Athena, who was the one who sort of oversaw like Odysseus' homecoming and all that stuff. And so because it's narrated by goddesses and not by Penelope herself, we get a view of Penelope from three different perspectives. We've got Hera, who looks at her primarily as a mother and a wife, where we've got Aphrodite, who looks at Penelope as sort of like a living, breathing woman with needs and wants and that kind of thing. And then Athena, she doesn't really understand how Penelope works, you know, in terms of the grand story. And so instead she kind of focuses on her more as like the goal for Odysseus. But in the meantime, she sort of gets inside her head and comes to sort of understand her as a complex, multifaceted person. And so these books are really phenomenal. There is also some other side character stuff. There's one character who's an Egyptian named Kenamon, and I love him so much. He's sort of set up as sort of the one good suitor, and the things that he adds to the dynamic of everything is just so good. But these books are phenomenal. They are very slow burn, so take your time with them. Don't expect anything that'll rush through. If you compare this to something like, here we go, A Thousand Ships by Natalie Haynes. Now this is fairly short. This is shorter than this, and it's one book, and it follows a vast amount of time. It follows all of the Trojan War, and it follows all of the events of the Odyssey. And it jumps around between different people. You get inside all their different heads, and there's lots of different perspectives on it. And so it's more like a mosaic telling the story of this big, long conflict through kind of vignettes from the point of view of different characters. This is very much a novel, and it's not, it's not racing through it. It's taking time. This reminds me very much of the first half of the first book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, A Game of Thrones, where we've got the status quo, what's going on, who are the players, what are the conflicts that are going on, who is trying to seek power, who is trying to keep things the way it is. And so this feels very much like that. It's very much a very tense situation, a very complicated scenario where you've got a tricky political dynamic that's going to fall apart at any minute, and there is violence on the horizon, but everyone is sort of doing the best they can to either keep things stable or to keep them from getting worse. And so this, you do have to kind of commit to it, but it's very much worth it. The language is gorgeous. The poetry of sort of the different perspectives of the different goddesses on the characters is so good, and I'm really, really enjoying this. But I can see how some people might read this one and then be like, well, that was okay, but I don't really want to continue the series. But definitely continue it, I promise you. Book 3 is like this cathartic culmination of everything that comes through. It's the confluence of everything that came before, and it's so satisfying. So you have to kind of deal with the setup and the characters and the simmering tension of the situation, because when that tension breaks, it's so good. So yes, I started this last month. I'm going to finish the next book this month, and I'm really, really enjoying it. Would highly recommend it. Next up would be my favorite nonfiction reads, and unfortunately I did not read any nonfiction this month. Last month. This is something that I want to sort of fix for next month, is I want to read more nonfiction. I love ancient history and Cold War history, which is kind of an odd pairing, but ancient history, so like ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and then the whole era of the Cold War is like my favorite era ever. All the political stuff and all of the changes that happen in kind of the global landscape were just phenomenal. And so this upcoming month, or this month, June, I do want to read more nonfiction stuff. I've got Mary Beard's SPQR, which I picked up a while ago, and so I'm looking forward to reading that. And I'm going to be reading Virgil's Aeneid this month, and so that would be a good time to kind of switch over to Roman history. So I'm really excited for that. But no nonfiction reads this month. Next up would be my favorite fiction standalones, and I think I only read one standalone book this month, and that was Vaishnavi Patel's Goddess of the River. This was beautiful. This follows a section, well, not a section, it covers one character from the Mahabharata, the ancient Sanskrit epic that is like one of the greatest epic poems ever created by any culture on earth ever. It's massive, to the point where there's very few like unabridged translations, because an unabridged translation would be like multiple volumes, like it can't fit in one book. But this follows sort of one character, the sort of personification of the Ganges River, Ganga, and her connection to one of the characters, who is her son, who features in the main conflict of the Mahabharata. And so it's sweeping. It follows a very long stretch of time. And so one thing you need to kind of be aware of is that there is going to be time jumping. It's told a little bit out of order. So we'll have moments where we'll look at the son when he's grown up, and then we'll jump back to him as a child and seeing how the events of his childhood led to the decisions that he made as an adult. And then we've got Ganga herself, who's a very complicated, nuanced character. She's a goddess, and so she understands humanity on a very sort of surface level. She was mortal for a brief time, and so she was able to live among people and sort of come to kind of understand them. But her idea of sort of what people are and what makes mortal humans work and what drives them is a little outside her purview for a lot of it. And so much of the book is her coming to understand her relationship with her son, which is very strange because he sort of lives among people and she's a goddess. And then there's also her kind of understanding of the main conflict that's at the heart of the story. And so this is definitely one I would say you don't need to read the Mahabharata in full to understand this, but it might help if you either read an abridged version of it or if you read like a summary of the major players at least, so that you know who everyone is, because there is quite a few characters and it starts out fairly simplistic where you've got just a few characters and then you're like, okay, I can follow this is good. But then it sort of jumps ahead to the middle of the conflict and you've got a ton of different people, and there's people who are called different names depending on their context, and so it's a very big cast of characters, and so you can kind of get lost. I had to sort of refer to the wiki quite a bit, but overall I really enjoyed this one. I loved her first book, Kaikeyi, which looked at a character from the Ramayana, and this book was just phenomenal. But this is definitely one that after I've read this, I do want to read at least an abridged version of the Mahabharata, or Mahabharata. It's spelt Mahabharata, but I think the author pronounces it without the A at the end. So I think it's Mahabharata. But anyways, I do want to read more of her work. So if you're out there, Vaishnavi Patel, I love your work. I love it so much. Please keep writing books because we need more of it. And especially myth retellings that are outside of the sort of more familiar Western canon, so like Greek and Norse stuff. More mythology out there, please. We need more of it. Next up is books that surprised me last month, and for that one I'm going to have to go with Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. This was so much fun. I was expecting it to be more satirical and ironic in the vein of like Mansfield Park. I was not expecting it to be as funny, like laugh out loud, hilarious funny as it was, because this book was written quite early. I think this is sort of considered maybe one of her juvenile novels, so it was quite early, but it was published quite late. It was published after her death, and this one is just delightful. It's a fairly simplistic story. It's not as nuanced as something like Pride and Prejudice or Mansfield Park. It's very much just a comedy of errors almost. The main character, Catherine, is such a delight. She's sort of this charming, adorable airhead who is quite young. I think she's 17 at the beginning, has no clue how the world works, and all of her knowledge of everything comes from reading like Gothic novels, and she loves things that are sort of creepy or scary. That's her favorite genre, and so you get lots of references to like Anne Radcliffe's book, like The Mysteries of Udolpho, and there's just all these silly little moments where she's around other people and she has no clue what they're talking about or like the context or whatever, and she just sort of chimes in with her sort of amiable comments, and they're sort of like, okay, that's nice, sweetie, that's so good. But overall, this is it's so delightful. It's so fun. It's very fluffy, but in the best way possible. It's a delightful, fun summer read. So I would definitely highly recommend this one. This one, I was not expecting this to be as laugh out loud hilarious as it was. It's great. Next up on the list is books that disappointed me, and I wasn't really deeply disappointed by anything that I read this month, but one is The Templar Legacy by Steve Barry. Now, I read these books. This is book one of the Cotton Malone series. I got it from the library because I'd read it a million years ago, and I remember really enjoying the series. He's a great writer, and it kind of came around the same time as like the Da Vinci Code, but it was sort of less pretentious than Dan Brown's writing, because, one thing that kind of annoys me about the Dan Brown novels is the main character is always sort of shocking people with how how knowledgeable and how brilliant he is. And everyone's like, oh my god, I never knew that, you're so smart. And it just feels a little much. Like, he's a good writer. Dan Brown is a good writer. The plots are quick, and his characters are good and interesting, but his main character is just a little insufferable. And so this was sort of a response to that, and Cotton Malone is a lot more grounded. He's sort of an ex-spy. He's from Georgia, I believe, so he's a southern kind of guy, and he's a bookseller, like a rare book dealer. And so he's not, a professor of anything, but he just sort of knows stuff just because of practical reasons and because he's a spy. And so I remember really, really enjoying the books because it's just globe-trotting adventures and solving mysteries and relic. But this book was just, I don't know, it was just a little painful. I feel like I remember the later books because they were a lot better. And so I was reading this one through rose-colored glasses. But the group of people that ends up traveling with him is huge. It ends up being something like 7 or 8 people. And so it's almost comical because, whenever you think of like a group of adventurers going through caverns and tunnels in, ancient ruins and stuff, you always imagine like 3 people maybe. And in this one, it's like there were so many people involved in the main group, and I almost couldn't keep track of all of them. And so they would have conversations, and there would be like people talking, and it was a little ridiculous. And so the pacing felt a little off, but the book itself is fine. The villain is great. I really like the villain, and there's a side sort of line with this character who is a member of the Knights Templar and the internal politics of the group, and it's really, really genuinely good. There's some great discussions about like biblical history, and it's a little iconoclastic in the way that it approaches like the Gospels and everything. And so like everything about this is stuff that I would genuinely really enjoy, but the plotting of it was just a little rough. So I think I will continue the series. I got it from the library, so if they have the others, I might check them out, when I have a free moment where I don't know what to read next, because they are enjoyable popcorn books. But I feel like the later books are sort of better plotted than the first one, even though I liked the concept of the first one and the characters. So we'll see how that goes. But overall, that would have to be sort of my most disappointing, but it was only slightly disappointing. It wasn't really like a bad, like I DNF'd it because it was so awful kind of thing. Nothing like that. And so that was the month of May. It was a pretty breezy month. It was lots of short books, like the crime novels that I was reading, they were all fairly short. Northanger Abbey was really short. So it was lots of little books, and then the kind of longer books was like the Songs of Penelope books. Those were kind of the ones that I spent the most time on, and then I read the other ones kind of here and there because you can breeze through them in like a day or two. But for the most part, it was a pretty good month. I'm looking forward to next month. As I said, I'm going to be starting the Aeneid once I finish the Songs of Penelope trilogy. And I'm going to be starting the Aeneid, and then I'm going to read some Roman history. I'm excited. I also started reading the Hunger Games books. I'm reading the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes right now, which I've never read before. I'm really, really enjoying it. The Hunger Games trilogy is incredible, and it's one of those like YA novels that I really feel like will stand the test of time and become one of those like classics of the genre, because it really is genuinely well written and poignant political commentary. And so this one is really, really good. And then I'm going to read Sunrise on the Reaping next, and then I'll probably reread the original trilogy after that when I get to it, just because I'm feeling nostalgic and I want to reread them and see if they still hold up. So that was the month of May. One other thing for June that I do want to do is I do want to kind of read more classic novels. I've been feeling the need to sort of dive into something a little meatier and heavier. I think after reading the Songs of Penelope trilogy, which is really not dense, but it's complex and poetic, and it just sort of has made me want to read something like Virginia Woolf. I don't know. I still have 2 more Toni Morrison books that I haven't read, so maybe I'll read those, but we'll see how it goes. I'm very much a mood reader, so I can't like plan out my TBR that much. It's kind of like I will read this, and then all the other stuff that I read around it is like, maybe we'll see what strikes my fancy, because from day to day, my tastes are kind of different. So we'll see how that goes. But anyways, with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.